Wayne, is it good to go?
Good morning, everyone. This is our second to last meeting of this performance funding work group. We hope to make some decisions in the next two meetings. Obviously, we have to. We're going to ask you for some decision points today. We'll ask you to have some good discussions over these decision points. And our hope is that by the time the next meeting is over, we'll be able to have a document or be able to write a document anyway with recommendations to the legislature. So I'm going to ask you to put on your seatbelt and go. It's been a heck of a night. We had some elections happening. I guess you probably heard about it. I know Senator Givens and Chair Tipton has heard about it. We want to congratulate both of them in their re-election campaigns by large margins. So congratulations to both of you all, and we're happy to see you around a little longer. Just know we'll be knocking on your doors regularly. Not that we haven't before, but we appreciate both of you and what you've been able to bring to higher ed, and we appreciate you in this conversation. John, good to see you, sir. I mean, we hope to have a little more conversation with you a little later on. Hopefully we'll present something to you to the governor's office on what higher education needs, and hope that you all can find a way to represent us. So we'll throw that in before we get started today. And welcome to all of you to, once again, this second to last meeting. Ashish, are you on the line? Well,
I am.
Well, congratulations on your board appointment to ask you, by the way. And I heard you recognized locally also.
I'm just hoping I'm not peaking too early, Aaron. That's
that's what happened to me, So for the last 40 years, I've been trying to make up for that, and it hasn't worked. So good. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's always nice to get a little recognition, but it's a lot to do with NKU. And I want to thank Chris Brown up there too. Kentucky State was on the board for several years, and in fact was responsible for nominating me. So I want to thank him as well.
Well, we're going to talk in our president's meeting a little bit about ASKU. Actually, I sent that out to you. We got a few things to talk about, but that's one of them. But we'll talk about that at 11 o'clock. We're going to get this going. Any questions to ask us before we do get it going from anyone?
Yes, President Thompson.
Yes.
I got a question. Meaty agenda, a lot of decision points. I think we also should consider a second meeting this month.
Okay.
Do you want me to do a roll call before you get started on actual business?
That's probably a good idea, Heather. Thank you so much. And budget director, we'll come back to that, but I think you probably have some good reasons why you want to make that recommendation, would be my guess. Yeah, go ahead, Heather, and do a roll call, please.
Absolutely. President Thompson.
Here.
Budget Director Hicks.
Here.
Senator Givens. I saw him.
I'm unmuted and now I'm here.
All right, great. Glad to have you. Representative Tipton.
Here.
Great. President McFadden.
Here.
President Brown.
Here.
President Zarapata.
Here.
President Morgan.
Here.
President Jackson.
Here.
President Baidya.
Here.
President Capilouto.
I was muted. Here.
Thank you. President Bendapudi.
Here.
And President Caboni.
Here.
Wonderful. Have a great meeting.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Wayne. Folks, we have several items on the meeting agenda. Then I'll pick up Budget Hicks' comment from earlier. We're going to revisit we call it the MUSU proposal. It's really from several presidents. Bob Jackson just did a really good job of presenting it to us. We're going to talk about some major decision points today. As I said earlier, we got a couple of meetings to finish these out, and possibly with recommendation from Budget Hicks, maybe another meeting this month. We need to talk about the stop loss going forward, the modified small school adjustment, the percent of formula share approach, which Bill will talk about in great detail, non-residential student weighting, premiums to underserved populations, and weighting between sectors. What I will tell you is we've gotten a lot of input from a lot of different places. Data are showing some real live items I consider about what's worked maybe and what hasn't worked, what we need to think about tweaking if we want to keep it. But with that in mind, I'm going to let Bill jump in here in a second. But Budget Hicks, Budget Director Hicks, did you want to give us a little more information on your recommendation now, or wait till the end of this meeting?
Oh, wait, I'm just perceiving that the number of decisions will probably require another meeting.
Okay, fair enough. And that's possibly the case. I'll be pushing us hard to at least think seriously about what these decision points are and the pros and cons. As you all know, we're basing this on a series of consensus outputs. In other words, I'm sure not all of us are going to agree fully with these, but we want to make sure we get as close as possible, that it represents what we all feel that we can live with. So with that in mind, if there's no more questions, I'm just jumping into it. Bill, why don't you start going over some of these points here?
Thank you, President Thompson. Good morning, everyone. And as President Thompson indicated, there's a lot on this list for today. Some of these slides you've seen before, so I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on every one. And we want to allow plenty of time for discussion among work group members on each of these topics. So there's no need to think that we've got to rush through all 6 of these items and get them all done today. But we'll see how far we can get and try to make some progress. Next slide, Heather. So the first major, well, actually, before we get into the major decision points, just quickly, I want to remind the working group members what was that proposal that was put forth by several of our presidents at the last meeting. We have referred to it as a Murray State proposal, but it's actually a proposal from a number of presidents, and Bob Jackson, as convener of the president, was asked to bring it forward. And I paraphrase this somewhat just to simplify it, but there were 3 main components. There was the recommendation that the work group consider adopting a 0% stop loss for next year. And then beginning in 2022-23 and for every year thereafter, adopt a perpetual 2% stop loss. And of course, as you know, that would limit potential redistribution of funds among institutions. And then lastly, the proposal contained a component that's requested that the work group consider eliminating the fiscal cliff at KSU, Moorhead, and Murray. And that could be accomplished by increasing the small school adjustment at those institutions, and it was suggested that you use an amount equal to their respective hold harmless allocations. And so we're going to actually address 2 of these in the first 2 major decision points that we're going to put on the table for your review and discussion today. So next slide, Heather. And again, there's the list, and the 2 items that pertain to that Murray State proposal are obviously the stop loss going forward and the modified small school adjustment. Next slide, Heather. I'm not going to go through this word for word. This slide contains some of the paraphrased language from the performance funding statute. That first bullet just provides a definition of the stop loss provision. I think all of us know what that is. I'm reminding everyone in that second bullet that the statute said there should be a 3-year phase-in, a 0% stop loss in 2018-19, 1% in 19-20, and a 2% stop loss in the current year. But that last bullet is extremely important, as everyone on this call knows, and the language, again paraphrased, said except by enactment of the General Assembly, hold harmless and stop loss provisions will not be included in 2021-22 and thereafter. And I think that forms the basis for the proposal of some of our presidents to have, some level of stop loss. Next slide, Heather. We talked about this 2 meetings ago. Unless the General Assembly does take some action to maintain a stop loss provision, 3 of our universities and 6 of our KCTCS institutions are going to be facing fiscal cliffs next year. And some of those fiscal cliffs are fairly substantial, and you're going to see more about that on the next slide. You may recall that we sent out a performance funding survey this past summer, and we had responses from the university presidents and from the KCTCS presidents, all 16 of those KCTCS presidents, and we've got a slide to show you in that regard. But the majority of those presidents preferred a 2% stop loss going forward. As we talked about just a couple of slides ago, Murray State University, on behalf of several presidents, put forward a 0% stop loss proposal for next year. And I think that was really, once we got the word from the state budget director that we might need to begin planning for a significant budget cut in the current year, and given all of the increased cost and foregone revenue related to the COVID-19 pandemic, uncertainty about any federal stimulus money, several institutions contacted President Jackson and said, gosh, we now prefer a 0% stop loss. But as everybody on this call knows, there were at least 2 members and maybe 3 at the last meeting that spoke up and said they really did not support a 0% stop loss for next year. Next slide.
Well,
yeah.
I would just want to remind everyone, we certainly know about the uncertainties of federal legislation and await more information on state revenues and all. At some point there will be, I believe, some federal relief, and we will have a clearer picture, I hope, about our state situation. I just want to make sure our timing on decisions isn't made on a slice of time that in the near future we have more information and reconsider some of these assumptions.
Thank you, President Kepaloo. That's a good point. Any other comments at this point?
Bill, I would add one thing that you omitted, and I know it's on your mind as well. Several institutions are concerned about the pension component as well. You didn't add that. That's a huge unknown to many of us, not all of us, but that has significant financial ramifications.
Bill and Aaron, this is Ashish. I want to maybe reiterate the point I think I made at the last meeting. And I appreciate State Budget Director Hicks's comment about another meeting perhaps, because these are significant decision points that we've made. I think I want to repeat something that I know applies to us, but perhaps it may apply to others as well. Just to once again advocate for the fact that, and building on what Eli just said, we have a lot of things on our plate right now as we're navigating this really unusual situation, including most recently, as we know, several counties, including Northern Kentucky counties, have now been in the red zone. We've gone back to as much as remote operations as possible right towards the end of the term. NKU is also grappling with coming to terms with a major decision on its pension that has to be made before January 1, 2021. And my point again is not to say that these are difficult issues, but the fact of the matter is, in order for us to really come up with a sound long-term approach, I think in general, what my sense is over the last several meetings is that we're in agreement with the fundamental principles. There are some tweaks, maybe some additional changes we may need to make, as we've pointed out in some of the major decision points. All these are consequential without some of the uncertainty being addressed. And I know that we have a statute obligation that we have to come to terms with. But if there is any way we can come to some short-term agreement on some things with a recommendation to the General Assembly, then and then resume the conversation next summer with a plan for before of December 21, re-looking at the model. This is what I think some of us refer to as the pause button, a 0% stop loss for 22, and then really coming back with some longer term questions. Because to be perfectly honest, and I appreciate State Budget Director Hicks's, even with that additional meeting, whether we have both the time and frankly, the key attention that we need to do to analyze every aspect of this, because we're all trying to find ways in which we improve on the model moving forward. So I just want to reiterate something that I've said before, which is that this is a lot to absorb at a time when all of us are being stretched in very, very unprecedented ways.
Thank you, President Padilla. Any other comments at this stage? Okay, next slide, Heather. We have shared this slide previously. I believe it was 2 meetings ago. And what it's showing is the budgetary impact. It's an estimate of allowing stop loss and hold harmless provisions to sunset. In the first column is the current year fiscal 2021 formula base, which is the same as the adjusted net general fund, regular general fund, minus debt service and minus mandated programs. In the second column is the calculated hold harmless allocations from both the public university iteration of the funding model in the current year and the KCTCS funding model in the current year as well. And then in the last column to the far right is the estimated budgetary impact. And as you can see, several of our institutions are facing some rather significant fiscal cliffs. Kentucky State University, it's estimated that they could lose as much as $6.9 million of their funding available to educate students, or about 38% of their current year formula base. Hazard Community and Technical College, about $3.5 million, about a third of their funding base for educating students. Southeast Community College, 23%. And so these are some rather significant fiscal cliffs that are pending. And so some action needs to be taken if we don't want these funds to be redistributed next year in the performance funding model, either the public university model or the KCTCS model. Next slide, Heather.
Hey, Bill.
Yes.
This is John Hicks. Just for the observers and others who haven't been inside the formula, explain the reason that the fiscal cliff could have that result.
The reason is because according to the student success metrics and the operational support metrics that were agreed upon by the working group 3 years ago, which includes the student success metrics, the progression metrics at 30, 60, 90, the bachelor's degree metric, and the premiums for STEM plus H and low income and URM degrees produced. According to the level of productivity of some institutions, they already have more funding than the model would indicate that they should. And other institutions, particularly those that have seen growth over the past 4 to 5 years in some of those student success metrics, the model is indicating that they have less funding than they should have. And so the model would basically say those funds need to be redistributed. But because of the stop loss percentage, the 1% last year and the 2% this year, there's a limit to how much of those funds can be redistributed. And so the funds that KSU and Moorhead and Murray have in their base that's not warranted according to the productivity as defined in the model, they get to keep those funds in their base, and those funds don't get redistributed because of that stop loss limit. If there were no stop loss limit, those base funds would be reduced at each of those institutions and redistributed to the others.
Thanks. In the underlying premise is because 100% of the funding is to be included in the model.
Yes.
Which is a statutory requirement.
Yes.
It is, and one of the only states in the nation that actually runs the 100% through the model.
And of course, State Budget Director Hicks, as you know, we do back out the debt service. We do back out those mandated programs, and we're very thankful that you and your staff and the governor chose to include those line items for those mandated programs in your executive budget, because those carried forward and wound up in the enacted budget. So that's very helpful. So we deduct that. And then we also deduct what's called a small school adjustment for the public university model. At KCTCS, they deduct what's called an equity adjustment. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute. And what you have remaining are the allocable resources that run through the funding model. And yes, we do run 100% of the allocable resources through the funding model. And then based on how an institution performs or the productivity of an institution relative to its peers within the model, that determines how the funds should be distributed.
Bill, this is Senator Givens. What percent does the allocable resources represent?
Of the total funding?
Of the total, yes.
Off the top of my head, I would say the allocable resources are about 80%, 85%. Because you've got 110 million in mandated programs that are backed out. Not a lot of debt service in the current year. I want to say it was a little over 300,000. But then you also back out about another 10% for that small school adjustment. So it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 80% of the funding gets run through the performance funding model. And what a lot of people don't realize, and this is one of the advantages of having that stop loss, is even though you run 100% of the allocable resources, or let's just say 75% of the total regular appropriation through the funding model informs how you distribute that 2%. And so you're only distributing that 2%. And the way it's been, the model has been functioning over the past 3 years, every institution, when they receive their enacted appropriation in the budget bill, that regular appropriation is something they can count on. It's that 2% that's been carved out, or the 1% last year that went into the performance fund, that you may or may not earn back based on your performance. So even though we're running 100% of the allocable resources through the model, we're only distributing that 2% carve out in the current year based on what the model is telling us.
So very briefly, if you would, following up on Director Hicks' questions to you, I want to summarize what I think I know and what I think I heard in your answer, and then do help correct any errors I may make. Really, it boils down to, in my mind, in responding to his question, it boils down to two things. It boils down to a lack of new money. Why the fiscal cliff? Lack of new money is part of that equation in my mind. Also, the historic FTE imbalance that you mentioned. So we're rolling into carrying a legacy of the old shares model, along with the lack of new money. Am I right in thinking it's those two things?
You're absolutely correct. It was those historical artifacts of, some institutions had shown some rather significant enrollment growth. Others had static growth, or maybe even slight enrollment decline. And that created that imbalance in terms of the funding for FTE. And so those historical artifacts came with the levels of funding for each of those institutions as we implemented the model 3 years ago. And you're absolutely correct. A really beneficial solution to eliminate those fiscal cliffs would have been, had we been able to get some additional appropriations each of the last 3 years.
Great, thank you.
I want to jump in and just say this. Yes, you're right on both of those. The historic way we've done it in the past, we're carrying remnants of that until we get to equalization, if you want to call it that. And the two ways to get there was what we originally counted on, new money going into it to take us there. And the other way was to really get it in balance by taking it away from some institutions to level it out, right? So Senator Givens, your point, and I know this is your point, at least I think so, that another way of thinking about this, if we don't put new money in it, we may actually end up once again with some quote unquote imbalance based on the previous way of doing business, right? But the idea that KSU and Moorhead and to some degree Murray, still because of the size, this is where size counts to some degree, right? Because it takes X amount of money to open up, the operation, right? And if you don't have enough students to even that out, FTE to even that out to where it looks like you have a balance between institutions, then there will become a volume issue that we ultimately don't really want to happen in this kind of model either. So I did want to throw that in.
I'd like to add a little more context too. I think all the points made are highly relevant. It's obvious from the last presentation, when I went back and looked at that bill, that in our situation, we have grown enrollment. It's up by some 3%. We move a small amount of dollars. It certainly is magnified today if we don't have some hold harmless address. But while we've gone up over 3% enrollment, our FTE enrollment's gone up about 1%. So even though, with this model with no new funding, we have realized new funds, the volume award is not that handsome. And there are lots of other components in this model, having been there when it was birthed, that took in other considerations about the different missions of our university that I wouldn't want us to lose sight of.
And as a matter of fact, Eli, we will be talking about that exact point later on in this presentation, because it is important that we do remember how we negotiated that. I mean, I was around that table too. And there are several items that several variables that go into that metric of how we look at different submission that I asked Bill to talk about in great detail, because I know that was an important conversation to many of you.
Aaron and Bill, I just reminded, based on what Senator Givens just mentioned, and I think the interpretation, Bill, you provided, which I completely agree with. You had shared a slide in the previous presentation about state appropriations per FTE across institutions, and with just looking at some of those numbers again, Tim Caboni and I will clearly, I think, see that our state appropriations per FTE remain amongst the lowest. For NKU, Bill, if you want to confirm, the variation in our state appropriations per FTE is about nearly $680 per FTE from the average, and closer to $900 per FTE from the median. So we are still significantly below what was as the historical challenge that we continue to face. And I guess part of what I'm seeking to is, you're right, it's new money and the historical perspective combined that puts us in this position. And but of course, I would be remiss if I didn't advocate for some level up funding, because that's not an insignificant amount to be off both the average and the median state appropriations per FTE. That's from the previous slide that you had shown in the last meeting.
President Thompson, if I could dovetail what Ashish is saying, I really appreciate the focus on being equitable. But the reason we have a performance funding model is to adjust the way in which we're funding our institutions. And I agree, avoiding a huge fiscal cliff is something that we want to do for all of our universities, not designed to cause harm. At the same time, in the absence of new money, if we don't want a legacy system that is continuing those inequities among institutions, which does penalize Northern and WKU, I think that we've got to be serious about at least not changing the mechanism that shifts those dollars. I'm not suggesting it's 100% going through the formula, and I understand that we're in a challenging year, and I'm always hopeful for additional appropriations. But the reality is that we made a decision as a state. I wasn't around the table, but my understanding of it was to change the way in which we funded our institutions. And instead of doing it across the board FTE, we're going to base it on outcomes. Well, that means we need to shift dollars based upon performance. And I know 2% is painful, but as Eli suggests, this is a small percentage of a percentage. And so, again, I will reiterate the position that I had in the last meeting, which is we must continue to move dollars. Hopefully it's from new dollars, but if not, I think we have to reward performance. Otherwise, we're just bringing that legacy forward.
I think President Caboni makes a really good point, and it dovetails on what Senator Givens just said. It's not 2% if you have a 2% stop loss. It's not 2% of the entirety of the regular appropriation. It's 2% of that 75% that you're going to run through the model. So it's not exactly 2% of the total appropriation for each institution.
Bill, one other thing that I would add that really hasn't been brought up, and all the points are excellent points in regard to this, but the absence of new money really magnifies all this, number one. Secondly, there's a total public funds issue that we should look at some point in time too. All of our tuition rates are very different. Some are at the low end and some are at the higher end. So when you look at total public funds plus appropriations, there's a consideration given to that as well. And there was and lastly, there was a balancing effect to additional monies to institutions a couple of legislative sessions ago as well, because I was involved in around the table with some of these discussions as well. And so there was a special appropriation component that we don't want to forget as we discuss this.
That's absolutely correct. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'll throw in one last point. It's and then we probably need to move on, Bill, to get through some of these. But it's not just a lack of new money. There's also been continual cuts, and so that digs farther deep into the way we look at equalization too. So it's yes, a lack of new money, but when you have cuts, that relies to some degree on the old formula also, and so that exacerbates it a little more. So yeah, Bill.
And I'm going to move on here quickly, but I just want to respond to what President Jackson just said. You're absolutely correct. You're referring to the equity adjustment where Northern and Western received additional appropriations. I want to say it was about 4 years ago. And that occurred right around the time we implemented the performance funding model. The other thing I wanted to assure you of, President Jackson, I haven't forgotten your request, and we have requested the most recent net tuition and fee revenue numbers from all of the campus CBOs. And at our next meeting, we will have that graph that you requested that shows what is the funding per FTE on a total public funds basis. And the other thing that we've done, and this responds to your statement, President Vidia, because the funding model treats the earned credit hours component for non-resident students at a 50% weighting, we've also redone that graph. And it narrows those gaps between Northern and Western and the other comprehensive institutions. When you use a 50% weighting for non-resident students in the FTE calculation when you do that graph. And so we'll be sharing that and that total public funds approach at our next meeting. Next slide, Heather, and I'm gonna go through quickly so you guys can get to the discussion. We've shown this before. The graph on the left, the blue bars are the number of institutions that indicated a preference for a certain stop loss percentage. You can see that 5 out of 8 institutions indicated that they preferred a 2% stop loss. On the right-hand side of the page, the red bars represent the 16 KCTCS institutions, although only 15 responded. So 8 out of 15 of the KCTCS presidents favored that 2% stop loss over any other level of stop loss. And so this was part of that performance funding survey that we sent out this past summer. But as I said, once we were asked to do planning estimates for a budget cut, several of the presidents have gotten back, not only to to President Jackson, but the CPE staff as well, indicating a preference for a lower stop loss level. Next slide, Heather. And I'm not going to spend very much time on this at all. I thought this would be a useful resource document. What this table is showing is hypothetical stop loss contributions for a range of stop loss percentages going from 1% through 5%, because most of the responses that we got on the survey indicated a preference for stop loss amounts within this range. And this is an estimate for next year. And as you can see from the footnote, it assumes performance funds earned in the current year become recurring to the base. It assumes flat funding, which may or may not be a valid assumption, but it also assumes no change in debt service or mandated program funding. But this allows each institution to look at the various levels of stop loss percentage and see what their institution would be contributing. For example, at the 2% stop loss, UK would contribute about 3.7 million, U of L 2.5 million, Kentucky State 364,000. But if you look at K-State at the 5% level, K-State would be contributing $911,000. Now, what K-State is thinking about when they're looking at this is if there are no changes, if there were a 5% stop loss, they're essentially going to give up that $911,000 because of that fiscal cliff. They have virtually no opportunity to earn those funds back. So whatever stop loss is selected, I would say definitely for KSU and probably for Moorhead, those are dollars that they're going to contribute to the pool that they are not going to get back. Next slide, Evan. And Aaron, I'm going to turn it back over to you to lead the discussion on this.
Well, as you all know, CPE, I had some of my recommendations I'd like to get us to somewhere along the way, but we're trying to be impartial to this process. So as Bill, as he's answering questions based on what's given to him and not necessarily what he feels or I feel or anyone else. So I want to make that clear to everybody as you do ask questions that we are I look at it from a statewide perspective and not necessarily a model perspective about what's good for the state. So I wanted to say that in the conversation as we're answering the questions to let everybody know where I am. I probably will be asking for a couple of variable choices once we get to that, metric choices once we get to the end, but that's from a statewide perspective again. And I will say this before we get to these discussion questions. I was sitting around the table in the beginning and argued heavily, as an example, just full disclosure, for those things like the low income, URM, and some of those other metrics that I feel to some degree have worked, some not as well as we like. So anyway, full disclosure, so you all know where CPE is at. Discussion questions. When you look at the stop loss provisions going forward, I'd be very anxious to hear where each of you are thinking at this point in time. If you feel like you don't have that information or enough information yet to think about that, then you can say that also. But somewhere along the way, we need to make some choices here. We've gotten a lot of input from a lot of you, as a matter of fact, and you all are different on this. So I guess my question is, as we think about the stop loss provision for next year for 21, 22, and from 22 and 23, do you have any thoughts about what you would like to see?
Aaron, this is Jay Morgan. I'd like to return to our conversation. We had a little bit of it at our last work group meeting about a month ago around 21, 22 being at a zero stop loss because of the uncertainties of this year. I know it's been pointed out earlier in several conversations that may be a likelihood for federal dollars, but until those actually, are derived, it's really hard, very difficult in order to put a budget together. And from your time on a campus, you very well know that we're starting the budget process right now for next year. And to wait on a lot of uncertainty is very, very difficult. President Jackson also pointed out the pension issue, and I don't think any of us at this point know where maybe that conversation will go, but a 0% stop loss for 21-22 is something I'd like to keep on the table for discussion.
Well, I'm just going to pick you up from there, Dr. Morgan, and see what the others think about the 0%. I want to take that as a recommendation for discussion, if that's okay with you. Rest of the presidents or the appointed officials that's on this group, what's your thoughts about that?
Aaron?
Yes.
I actually am struggling with this issue because I'm usually a big believer in dollars follow performance and so on. But I have to say that for 21-22, I'm more amenable to some stop loss just because these are such unprecedented times for all of us. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you, Neely.
Aaron, we would be, as you know, we're down about 10% across all of our colleges in enrollment. Spring, I don't think is going to look much different than that. So we would be in favor of a stop loss.
Okay.
President Thompson, I agree. I also am a big believer in dollars following performance. Given the strange year, I do think not adding additional complexity makes sense. But I think that as we're having that conversation, we do have to have some coupling of the two issues, because doing 0% in next year, given where we are today, makes good sense, but not 0% in perpetuity, which is the point that I made. And so as we're having this conversation, I would argue for a percentage stop loss in year 22-23 that we add into the conversation, whatever that may be, 5%, 3%, 2%.
Okay. Yeah, and that's why we have both of those bullets there. You all can talk about them in tandem, or you can talk about them individually.
Aaron, this is David.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, David.
No, I agree. I think that there is an unprecedented amount of uncertainty for 21-22. You know, I think that the challenging part here, and I think we're going to have to lean on our policymakers on this call, is are we going to get back around the table and reassess this post COVID-19? Are we going to try to design a set of mechanisms and triggers that would impact whether we're going to move toward a more aggressive stop loss percentage? And Tim indicated 5, 7, 10%, whatever that might be. The model now is constructed to be 100% all in if we don't take any action. So can we bifurcate the decision? Is this a 1 year? Is this a 1 year recommendation we're going to make? And then the recommendation would be we would regather perhaps next fall to look longer term, or and maybe we kind of I'll just kind of throw that out there for the group. I think that makes it easier for decision making here.
Well, you know, David brings up the point that Ashish brought up, that do we make some decisions? And I'd be interested in hearing what Chair Tipton and Senator Gibbons and Budget Director Hicks say about this. Is that we make one recommendation with the idea that we regroup next year. I think that's what Ashish was bringing forward in his thought process, which now David has sounded like he backed that up to a degree. Or, you know, do we look at both of these currently and make recommendations? And we have to have this done we have to make all these recommendations by December 1, by the way, folks, just to let you know. You know, Senator Gibbons, Representative Tipton, Budget Director Hicks, what's your thoughts on this?
So this is Senator Gibbons. I'll jump in first and certainly understand the need of of everyone involved, but the president specifically, Ashish and President McFadden, that have spoken to this question. I'm a fan of making both decisions. I'm a fan of making the decision for the 21-22 and the 22-23. Make both decisions. The two together create a whole package in my mind that if the world has changed significantly and we need to come back next summer and President Thompson, you call us back together and we say, we're going to reverse the decision we made. We have the same authority to do that as we do to meet next summer and make a decision going forward. So I'm a fan of both. That's my opinion.
Yeah, Senator Givens makes one point that I guess I should have made earlier. This callback this time was in legislation. We have the power to call back without legislation. So, I mean, I appreciate you making that point, Senator Givens. Representative Tipton, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, President Thompson. I'm always one who, these are critical decisions that we're making because we're making decisions that is going to impact, I believe, future generations of Kentuckians. And I hesitate to make critical decisions without having all the facts and all the data. And right now, we just don't have all the data. I know that we set up our budget based on a pessimistic forecast for this fiscal year. Through the first quarter, our numbers are above what we anticipated. I'm hopeful that Director Hicks probably knows where I'm getting ready to say. I'm hopeful that we're going to have a good report for October in a few days. And until the consensus forecast group meets in December, we have some better data. We see where our economy is going. It's very difficult to make concrete long-term decisions. So I'm open to the conversation of the stop loss. I just want to get more data as we go forward before making a final decision. And hopefully we can move forward on this and come up with a good work product.
Budget Director Hicks.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I tend to like the idea that Senator Givens put forth about making these decisions as a package. The reason I say that is we're going to run into difficult conditions in the future, right? So we need to set up a process that is agile enough to change, as we just talked about, but takes into consideration these things are going to happen. Now, not COVID-19, but fiscally, we look back at our history. We're going to have times in which we have budget cuts. We're going to have times in which we can maybe add money. So I'm supportive of the idea on the 22, 23 and beyond of making a decision now, knowing that decisions can be changed. Given the conversations, particularly from the presidents about the response to COVID-19 and the difficulties with the current year, I think it lends credence to an idea of zero stop loss in fiscal 22. And I would even consider some conditions in the going beyond in years in which there are reductions with that. So the General Assembly made a really wise move at the end of the 20 session to give the local school districts some relief on the attendance calculation that drives their SEEK money because of COVID-19. And I think a situation for fiscal 22 on the stop loss is an equivalency. To provide, just in a special situation recommendation. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, everyone. Let me just throw something out. I'm not saying I'm for this, but I'm looking at what's been turned into us already and what's been said. Just throw it out as a way to start a conversation on towards some reasonable vote. One is to put forth a zero stop loss for 21, 22, then a 2%, which most of you voted for beyond. The idea that if we don't get new money, we can put a caveat in there. Director Hicks, that's what I think I heard you say, that says that we would revisit this conversation based on what funding is. Representative Tipton points to the fact that there's a whole lot we don't know yet, which I think is a very reasonable statement. I'm just throwing that out as a point of at least a marker in the, throwing something out there to see what folks think about that thought process.
Aaron, I'd like to speak to it. We have several other proposals through this slide deck. One in particular is to roll in the whole harmless amounts into these small school adjustments. You know, the totality of doing all these things, to me, can really neuter this whole initiative. If I think the premise we operated under was Kentucky was going to be better off if we had more college and community college graduates. Simply saying 0% to me and opening up extreme flexibility for next year, I think, you know, undermines that primary premise. I certainly recognize in these extraordinary times, it can't be what it was before and all. I would want something above 0% just to keep our sort of focus.
Yeah, one other thing. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Eli.
No, I was saying some minimal amount at least. So that's just my perspective.
Well, and I'm throwing this out for us to not answer now, but for you to think about it, because Eli brings up a point. We have several decision points throughout this, and they all fit together, to be honest with you. What I'd like for us to do by the end of this meeting, hopefully, is to have some direction we're going. If we have to meet again this month before the last one, we can make those decisions then and have you think about it once we go through. So I'm going to, unless someone else has something to say about this, Bill, I want to come back and revisit this toward the end when we look at some of the other recommendations or decision points, not recommendations. We're basing all this on what you guys have told us, but some of the decision points when we get to them.
Oh, that's a
Aaron, this is Chris Brown from Kentucky State driving to my doctor's appointment, but I do want to chime in on it because I'm somewhere between U of L, Western, and Morehead. Certainly, Kentucky State is the huge elephant in the room on the whole harmless numbers, and I'm only 3 years in. So I want to at least say on the record that the performance funding metrics are driving significant improvement in the campus. And certainly with the 3-year rolling average, it will be some time before that evidence and sort of formula output. But depending on where a person's sitting at the table, you're going to feel very differently about the hold harmless. And so given where K-State sits and I'm sitting at this campus, I understand that position. But if I were Ashish or Western, I might feel very different. And so I think what Eli put on the table is an important one, because what I wouldn't want to happen is for us to propose something that's not palatable for the legislature, because I think performance funding has great aims and has ability to work for the Commonwealth, and then we end up with no relief from the fiscal cliff. So I don't as much as a zero may be the ultimate benefit for K-State, there are multiple competing interests in the state system. And I at least want to be on record as saying that K-State supports that and is not zero sum. So I think Eli's position is an important one.
Thank you, Chris. I will say one last thing, Bill, and then I'm going to ask you to keep going unless other people have statements. I think Eli and Chris makes the point that it should be noted. We do have data, Eli, that says that what we've done in higher education is having some economic impact, having some workforce impact. So just to let you know that higher education, we have data over and over again, can really show you the impact it has. The other point too, the performance funding model has driven, once again, I just throw this in, over the last 5 years, a 17% increase in overall credentials period up and down the ladder, including baccalaureate degrees, but for underrepresented minorities, as an example, only one example, we can look at the STEM 8 same way, underrepresented minority 37%. I mean, we're one of the strongest states in the union in closing that gap and still increasing the outputs. We're not just keeping one the same and then somehow raising the other. So I do want to point out that the premise behind this was that it would drive good workforce development, good economic development for an overall educated state. And obviously, from that standpoint, it's working. And we want to make sure, though, that all of our institutions, which is the conversation here, can take part in that at a healthy level and not just a few, as an example, at a healthy level. So anyone want to say any more about this before I ask Bill to move on?
I'd like to jump in and speak to something you just said a minute ago, President Thompson. And that is, if we go ahead and look at these next two decision points, that may inform some decisions about what to do in terms of the stop loss. Because what I hear a number of our presidents saying is that they're concerned about redistributing funding among institutions in absence of any new money. And so they're wanting to limit that redistribution. And obviously a 0% stop loss, without a doubt, limits any potential redistribution. A 1% stop loss would limit redistribution relative to a 2% stop loss because you're carving out less funding. But even, for example, a 2% stop loss, if you combine it with eliminating that fiscal cliff at KSU, Moorhead, and Murray through that modified small school adjustment, that limits redistribution. And Murray has put a new proposal on the table about this percent of formula share approach, which would allow you to apply the model differently given the circumstances. And what they're proposing there is if—
Bill, once you go into that, you'll get to that pretty soon. So let's move this one along.
But at any rate, that's another way that you limit the redistribution. And of course, the preferred method, I think, for all of us on this call to limit redistribution among institutions would be an infusion of new funding. And that limits redistribution among institutions as well. Go to the next slide, Heather. And I'm not going to spend an inordinate amount of time on this section. Right there, Heather, because we covered this toward the end of our last meeting. I think everybody knows that in that Murray State proposal, there was a modified small school adjustment for next year. You can see the specific language that was in that proposal, but that last bullet gets to the crux of the matter. Basically, the small school adjustments would be increased and the fiscal cliffs would be reduced at K-State, Moorhead, and Murray. Next slide, Heather. But I want to remind everybody that we also have a two-year college model. And back at our September meeting, KCPCS submitted a proposal to ask the working group to consider allowing them to make a change in their equity adjustment for fiscal 2021 and beyond. And you can see in the second bullet specifically, they want to use a community need index to provide some of those institutions that are facing that fiscal cliff a larger equity adjustment. So they're trying to get to the same place within their model that several of our institutional presidents are trying to get to in terms of the small school adjustment with the public university model. Next slide, Heather. So what this slide is showing is a comparison of performance distribution and hold harmless allocations for a modified small school adjustment approach, which is hypothetical on the right-hand side of the page. It's comparing it to the actual 2021 calculations that occurred in the current year. So in column A, that's the actual performance distribution for the current year. In column B, those are the actual hold harmless allocations for the current year. And for K-State, Moorhead, and Murray highlighted in yellow, those are those fiscal cliffs. So in the current year, had we added those dollar amounts to the small school adjustments at those institutions, in column C, you can see it would have made absolutely no change in terms of the distribution to the institutions that received positive dollars in the current year. But as you can also see in column D, what it would have had the effect of doing is just eliminating that fiscal cliff. Next slide, Heather. But if we look at next year, this is a similar table for fiscal year 20, 21, 22. And so in both cases, these are hypotheticals. But on the left-hand side of the page, columns A and B, that would be the current model with no changes, assuming flat funding, a 2% stop loss contribution, and no change in performance data. And you can see with a 2% stop loss, which would be $11.7 million roughly, how those funds would be distributed. Murray State University's hold harmless goes away, and they actually would pick up $262,000. But that fiscal cliff remains for Kentucky State and Morehead. If we adopt it, if the working group reaches consensus and recommend adopting this modified small school adjustment approach, and the General Assembly were to make that change, the right-hand side of the page shows the hypothetical under that approach. And so you can see in column C the performance distribution, that same 11.7 million, but those fiscal cliffs are eliminated. But as you can see in column E, what this does is it would benefit through additional funding K-State, Morehead, and Murray relative to the current model with no changes. And every other institution has to give up some level of the additional funding that they hypothetically could have earned next year with these in performance. Next slide, Heather. But I want to show you what are those institutions really giving up. And in this slide, I'm comparing the stop loss contributions for next year, the $11.7 million, to the distribution using that modified small school adjustment approach. And as you can see, under the assumption that the performance data does not change, we know that's not a valid assumption, but if it did not change, every university would have the opportunity to earn back their funding. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that one way to limit the redistribution, in addition to a 0% stop loss or a 1% stop loss, might be to have some level of stop loss. But if you were to eliminate those fiscal cliffs for 3 of our institutions using that modified small school adjustment, that at least gets them up to the same starting line. It eliminates those historical funding disparities, and it limits that redistribution among institutions. Go to the next slide, Heather. And again, we've got some discussion questions here. Do you want to go ahead and talk about this now, President Thompson, or do you want me to go ahead and show them what the percent of share formula proposal is and then come back to these questions?
Well, we'll come back to the questions, but I want to let everybody have an opportunity to ask you any questions on the modified small school adjustment. Bottom line, what that is saying is that the money that's in that hold harmless category would be put to the base, which is one way of getting to equalization, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, you're right, President Thompson. I forgot to say this, that this would get you to funding parity to start the next year immediately. And then any shifts in funding would purely be driven by performance, changes in performance, as opposed to historical artifacts of funding.
So yeah, there's 2 or 3 questions I'll throw in, and then please, folks, jump into this one. This is a big one in many ways, but you know, one question is if you ever believe that, I mean, there's going to have to be a whole lot of money given by the legislature to go in to get a parity among all, if in fact we're going to go with a revenue sort of way of thinking about this. Now we can cut everybody down to that, I guess, is another way of thinking about it. But the other way is to believe that these are small schools that's probably going to remain small schools with unique, you know, populations they're serving. And that in fact, if you want to get to a point of where everybody now gets to be on their own bucket, if you will, and in this case, you'll have a higher FTE for Morehead and KSU, but then, you know, they're on their own bottom, if you will, participating in the performance metrics at an equalization level. So I just wanted to put that on the table. Any discussion that anybody want to jump into?
President Thompson, I would like to say 1 or 2 items here. I want to thank Dr. Payne for this concept, because no one is losing and no one is really gaining. It brings parity, going forward as we look at this. And I think this is an important point. This scenario, this modified small school adjustment, this is assuming no new monies. Also, I think that's important to stress again. And lastly, I know everyone supports this. This eliminates putting any of our peer institutions at risk. And it doesn't matter which institution it is or institution, we must protect in this environment, those particular colleges and universities.
Thank you, Bob.
Bob,
Any
I just want to emphasize what you said. I want to make sure I understand this correctly. This is, again, from my understanding, this is only for this coming fiscal year. Is that an accurate statement?
No, the small school adjustment would be increased for those three institutions. And of course, we're talking about making, if the working group is amenable to the idea, making a similar modification to the equity adjustment at KCTCS. But once you make that adjustment, that small school adjustment would then be locked in and could only change if there's a budget cut.
Well, and I think maybe that helps me understand that. I think I do have some concerns about locking in for the long term, because I think it somewhat defeats the purpose we were saying earlier, which is that performance should drive results. Because if you start doing this going forward, then you're not really addressing both the performance issues and the historical shares, the 2 points that were brought up in the early discussion. So I do think that this requires some additional care and thinking before we go down to locking ourselves into something that's long-term and an adjustment. Yes, it does protect these institutions for the time being, but it does nothing then to go back to drive both performance, nor really some of the historical inequities we've talked about.
Yeah, I would add to what Hashish said is that this sort of wipes the slate clean. You restart everything. You called them sort of historical artifacts. I think what you said earlier, Bill, is the formula was designed to reward greater production of degrees. So that's why these are these amounts now. What we would say is we're going to reset. And the other question I'd have is, explaining this to a campus in terms of what we all need to do is complicated enough. But I think we have enough key signals that aligns our faculty and staff to say more degrees, more attention to STEM fields, more attention to low income, more attention to underrepresented minorities and so forth. And we had one decision rule to adjust for, quote, small campus. But does this mean going forward, the decision rule on small campus adjustment is somehow linked to this hold harmless amount?
No, and you would start next year at virtual funding parity, but because there would be a new year of performance data added, to that 3-year rolling average, institutions that performed would accumulate positive dollars in the formula. Those that did not have degree production or student progression above the sector average, they would see their share for those metrics decrease. And so there would still be a hold harmless allocation, and some schools would have negative dollars. But as you say, going forward, once you lock in those small school adjustment amounts for those institutions, what you're saying is, you had more money than given what you were producing according to the model. But we're going to say that that's water under the bridge. But once you lock in those amounts and start going forward, if you continue to be below average on any given metric, your share of any potential funding is going to decrease. the model would operate in its normal way, and you would accumulate additional negative hold harmless dollars. And any funds up to the level of a stop loss would be redistributed. And so this would allow the model to continue to operate as it currently does, but it just eliminates those rather large fiscal cliffs, primarily at KSU and Moorhead, but also at 3 or 4 of our community colleges. And I want to invite the president of, I guess, interim president of KCTCS to make any comments if he would care to do so, because it's my understanding from talking to Wendell Followill, your chief budget officer, that you've already had these conversations with your 16 presidents about modifying your equity adjustment, and that all of your institutions are on board with what you're proposing.
That's correct, Bill. We feel the community need index is a way for our smaller colleges to better compete and just to try and avoid having winners and losers.
And I guess one other comment I'll make, in case I didn't make it clear, by taking the approach that several institutions through President Jackson have proposed to eliminate these fiscal cliffs at KSU, Moorhead, and Murray, it does not create disequilibrium within the model. It actually creates a virtual equilibrium across the board. Whereas right now, we've got 5 universities at equilibrium. Murray's very close, so you might as well say 6. But Moorhead and KSU are outliers in terms of not being at equilibrium with the others. This would get everybody to an equilibrium status to start next year, and then any changes or shifts in funding or any new hold harmless dollars created would be a result of changes in performance.
I want to just point out one technical statement about all this. The legislation points to there should be an adjustment, but left it up to the council to determine what that was. And so that adjustment is in regulation and not statute. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that point too.
Bill, this is David. So for the small school adjustment, is it formulaic to, is this a lump sum number that we're using, or is it formulaic as it relates to FTEs?
It's just a lump sum number that's backed out on the front end. It's treated almost like mandated programs. So you're backing it out from the allocable resources. And the only thing that the model is considering are those allocable resources that you run through it. This will allow KSU, Moorhead, and Murray to retain those lump sum amounts in their base, just like their small school adjustments, just like any mandated program funding they may have.
Bill, this is Senator Givens. Let me first say, Aaron, thanks for that statement. That takes us off the hook. You get to make these decisions in the absence of the legislature. So hurrah for you and CPE. I'm joking. Bill, back up one slide for me. I think it's one slide. If Heather could back up one slide. What you just said is that, in essence, this is a lump sum dollar amount that's protected, right?
Yes.
And this presumes, I'm looking at the presumptions again at the bottom, relative to new funding, this makes a presumption or doesn't, or help me understand what new funding may do to this slide.
Well, the stop loss contributions would go into the performance fund. Any new appropriations from the state would go into the performance fund. And those funds would be distributed, based on the 1-year change in performance being added to the 3-year moving average going forward. If there were no change in performance, if you had a column A with the stop loss contributions, a column B, let's just say with $11.7 million in new state funding, and then a column C where you add those two together for 23-24 million, then in that modified small school adjustment approach, that 24 million would be distributed. And it would be roughly in proportion to the numbers that you see there, if there were no change in performance. But we know there's going to be change in performance. And based on trend data, we can see which institutions are trending upward on certain metrics and which ones are trending downward. But that new funding, as well as the stop loss contribution dollars, more of those dollars would go to those institutions that improve their performance, and less dollars would go to others. But every institution, if we had an equivalent amount of new dollars to go along with the 2% stop loss contribution, it would be very likely that every institution would earn back what they contributed in terms of the stop loss contribution through the combination of eliminating the fiscal cliff and adding those new dollars. And most of the state money would be to go to reward those institutions that showed improved performance.
Bill, let me briefly say that I think this is truly such inside baseball that CPE and the presidents need to decide this one. And I'm not joking about that part. This is something rolled out in front of the legislative body that I don't know that we can get enough people up to the education level to make the right decision. So I'm excited that it stays within CPE. I'll briefly mention this, and then I'll mic back off. We had a mechanism in the initial rollout that I think, in for lack of a better term, created a debt that each institution owed and paid down over time. I can't remember exactly what that was, but there was a little bit of an approach where we had a debt that was owed.
That's the hold harmless.
That was sort of smoothed in over time. And so as a thought, if that were something that could roll forward, maybe smooth it through a debt that's paid back over time instead of the cliff being there. Just a thought.
All right, thank you. Yeah, we'll give that some thought, Senator Gibbons.
Bill and Senator Gibbons, I think this is something certainly that the council can decide, but this model is built on a strong assumption, and that is the 2% stop loss that the legislature is going to have to set, correct?
That is correct. And by the way, Senator Gibbons, I wasn't making the technical truth to be one that relieved you all's input, because I think we need that. Eli's point's correct. So much of this operates together, right? Now, just as an example, if we decided, whoever decides, I mean, it doesn't have to be the full stop loss to the base. It could be, in fact, full hold harmless to the base. It could be a variety. It could be a quarter over one biennium, whatever. You could keep on going that way. But bottom line, if you wanted to get to an immediate equilibrium, if you will, then you put the small school adjustment that's in the hold harmless piece to the base, then everybody, once again, is competing at some equalization level. Now, the argument could be made, well, KSU has 6 more million to the base than what I do if I'm a UK, as an example. Well, that's true in that sense of the word, but KSU has an $18 million general appropriation budget. So losing that 6 million, which they are likely to lose unless we make some decisions on what we're going to do this coming year, in fact, takes away a third of their budget.
President Thompson, President Mendiputi, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Senator Gibbons. Sure. A very quick question is for you and Bill. I know that data are already in there to figure out. So in effect, the 6 million to Kentucky State, for example, would mean, let me phrase it as a question. Could we see what percentage of each school's funding would truly be at risk for performance funding if we did this? So for Kentucky State, I'm not formulating an opinion on what, I just want to understand better. If my calculation is right, would it leave about 40% of their funding is going to be at risk for performance funding, as opposed to over 90% for U of L? I mean, just, do you have those? Could you present it that way?
I don't have those numbers in front of me, but you're absolutely correct. The whole premise behind the small school adjustment and the way it operated in the comprehensive sector was we took 10% of each institution's general fund base, added it together, and then divided by 6 so that every institution had the same small school adjustment amount deducted from their base. And I want to say it was close to $4.5 million in the most recent year. And so $4.5 million being protected out of Western Kentucky University's base is a smaller percentage being protected. Obviously, KSU having the smallest base among the comprehensive institutions, that $4.5 million being protected was a larger number. So yes, by allowing them to protect an additional $6 million, it will allow them to protect a much larger percentage of their general fund base from actually running through the performance funding model. But that was the original intent of the small school adjustment. And President Thompson at that time was the interim president at Kentucky State University, and he and a couple of other presidents lobbied for a larger small school adjustment. Instead of 10%, I believe it was 20% that some of the presidents were asking for. And ultimately, the working group decided to go with the 10% level of small school adjustment. But yes, President Bendaputi, you're absolutely correct in your interpretation.
And percentage-wise, you're absolutely correct. I would ask you to think of the dollar amount too in that regard, because I'm not saying apples to oranges, but it's pretty well apples to oranges in that. I did argue for a 20% along with Wayne Andrews. I think at the time, some were arguing for 0, and I think we derived at 10. It was kind of like what we did with the out-of-state students with how we counted those folks. Senator Givens, you were going to say something.
Very briefly, President Thompson. Complexity, two quick thoughts. President Capilouto and President Thompson, you've mentioned this multiple times. All of these decisions do impact each other. So collectively, I think the package has to be arrived at as a whole. We can't take any single piece and make a decision on it. And that's what I think, President Thompson, you're guiding us toward. Secondly, a guiding principle I would love us to be able to use, skewing toward simplicity as opposed to skewing toward complexity, is something I would really, really enjoy. And if you look at the SEEK formula, that's the perfect example. The way we fund K through 12 education has become so complex and so difficult to unravel at times that the unintended consequences of any one decision are impossible to measure, for lack of a better term. So if we have the chance to skew towards simplicity, let's do that.
Fully agree on that, by the way. And I think we can get lost in inside baseball here. I just want to say that. And maybe what looks like huge decision points because of the complexity may not be. And we could spend a lot of time on that. I won't let anybody else want to say anything.
Yeah, just a quick comment, Bill. And I was wondering, because I think there is a lot here to unpack. This just occurred to me. How much of this? I know it's a question that comes up towards the end of the presentation on the weighting between the sectors. How much of this can be addressed if we did have differential weighting between, say, the research institutions, the comprehensives? Does that address any of this at all?
Well, this particular adjustment would not impact the distribution between sectors within the public university funding model. As I said earlier, it would essentially get KSU, Moorhead, and Murray up to the same starting line, if you will, of the other universities, and it would not create any disequilibrium within the model. Just the opposite, it would create virtual equilibrium as a starting point to start next year. So no, this would not impact, money going from the comprehensive universities to the research institutions or vice versa. It would only be each institution's own individual performance relative to the sector average on any given metric that would increase that institution's share of funding for that metric.
I think I'm going to need a little bit more information on this whole thing before I get, and I think Senator Givens's advice is good, which is that I think a thorough discussion amongst presidents will be critical before we move forward.
Bill, could I also kind of put on the table the coupling of all of these decisions? So, for example, I might support this small school approach, but I would not support it in the context of a 2% stop loss. If we get to equilibrium, well, let's have that stop loss be larger than 2%, 10%. Let's have the model actually do more of what the model is supposed to do. So that's number one. You're talking about equilibrium, but it doesn't really address the per FTE issue that Ashish and I have, right? And so how does it affect that? And then the third is, and I am, again, from a policy perspective, we are only 3 years into this, and we are pulling major policy levers to change the model. And again, not just simplicity is important, I think, but also not doing so much tweaking that we create unintended consequences. For good public policy to work, you have to allow it to shift. And here's the final point. I know we don't want to cause harm to any of our institutions, but I'm not sure reallocating dollars within the system is creating harm. Is it going to create some challenges? Yes. There's some pain involved? Of course. But it moves us toward what we said we wanted as a system, which is performance mattering and being rewarded. And so that's just all kind of what's in my head right now.
President Caboni, this is Bob again. The reason this came up, and I'd like to add this point again, and Senator Givens makes great points, and this should be packaged in some manner. The absence of new money and actually the cuts, as President Thompson pointed out earlier, is what's magnified this whole issue. So, a 30% cut for an individual institution, or a 20% cut for an individual institution in a relatively short period of time would be devastating within a year period. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. This has nothing to do with future metrics and performance, because new money, it's going to be allocated correctly through the performance funding model. We're talking on this particular slide, on slide 15, this is actually monies that are being carved from existing appropriations that are just being reallocated. And so that's what it's trying to protect, those number of community colleges and Kentucky State, Morehead, and Murray to a lesser degree.
But Bob, the flip side to that conversation is that if you look at the per student funding by FTE, we're underperforming and underfunded, and the same thing with NKU.
There's somewhat, in regard to this particular topic, there's somewhat two different issues. And I mean, here we're trying to, really protect institutions who may go off a cliff. The FTE funding on a future calculation basis is really, I could argue, is a different topic that should be looked at individually going forward. Again, 4 years ago, there was a parity appropriation made for two institutions. As an example, the parity that we're talking about here is taking from institutions and reallocating it to other institutions, and in amounts that could be extremely devastating to those institutions. So they're really two different points I think we're talking about.
Yeah, and let me point out just a couple of quick points I think is important. But let me make a very, at least from my viewpoint, Aaron Thompson, and not necessarily representing anybody other than me when I say this, that I agree. I think our performance funding metrics are working. So if you think about tweaking, not tweaking, or you think about hurting the way the metrics are performing to some degree, I think it's important. The student success metrics, I think, are working. I think we can do some things to make them work better, tweak a few things around low income. You know, a discussion point I like to have, because we are losing adult learners like crazy. Maybe want to consider that, or maybe not. I don't know. The point being here is that the legislation says for this year, they gave us 2% stop loss. After that, it goes off, which means that KSU loses, as an example. I won't use Morehead. I'll let Dr. Morgan use that. I don't know if Chris is on the line or not, but they would lose a third of their budget. Community colleges, as you see Hazard and other folks, that's the cliff. So there's two discussions. One is, do you tweak what we're doing in the performance funding model that would stop money from exchanging hands, or increase that, or whatever, is one level of discussion. Bob Jackson is right. The conversation here is twofold. One is, do you get to everybody to automatic parity, if you want to call it that, by putting a small school adjustment to their base, or some form of that, some formula, 1/3 or whatever of that over a period of time? Or do you want to get to a point whereby that we say that let everybody lose the money that they're losing now, and then if they can make it on their own after that point, that's kind of up to them. So I think these are two particular decision points in my mind, even though they work together in the overall way that we think about the model.
Aaron, I'd like to.
Aaron, this is Chris. I'm here, and I agree exactly with what you said. The ongoing challenge, I think, is Senator Givens.
If I could just respond, because no one is arguing that we need to keep a cliff in place, but perhaps instead of having a conversation around eliminating an entire cliff, you think about what is the step down, right? And so I think that maybe it's a fiscal step, and you do it over multiple years to get to something that is more equitable across the institutions in terms of the way in which the dollars are allocated. And look, I get that scale matters too. The difference in scale between Murray and WKU is significant. The difference in scale between WKU and UK is also significant. And so I think I'm not arguing to cause harm, but I am arguing to create movement within the system. And eliminating movement, I think, doesn't create the opportunity for incentives, or, you know, it's the carrot stick. And all of this would be fixed, Senator Givens, Representative Timpton, with that additional appropriation, right? So we're talking about the same thing. If the assumption is built in that we're going to have additional dollars, then this all works beautifully well. But again, allocating more or less of a reduction doesn't incentivize anything, really.
Any more discussion on this? We'll come back to it later, because this is a huge decision point, because it affects legislation. It's not one of those things that we can put off for a longer period of time, right? It is one of those things that the House and the Senate are going to have to pick up this year, because they only gave us a reprieve on the 2% for 1 year. So I would ask us to really know that. Any more discussion on this? We'll come back to all of these, as we said earlier, but any more discussion on this piece?
President Thompson, very briefly, this is Senator Givens again. And Bill, I think I know the answer to this question, but it's always safer to ask and have you provide the answer, because your credibility in answering is much, much greater than mine as it relates to the formula. And I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't, but if we say for FY22 a 0% stop loss, that totally negates what we see on the slide, does it not?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Bill, why don't you continue?
Yeah, right there, Heather. Thank you. As part of their campus summary statements, Murray State University put forth an additional proposal. This one is from Murray State, as opposed to several presidents coming through, President Jackson. But I think it's a proposal that's certainly worthy of consideration. And I think State Budget Director Hicks, this gets to your notion of you need to put something in place that's going to be able to be utilized in any given set of circumstances as we go forward in time. And I think Murray State has put something on the table that's intriguing here in that regard. But at any rate, what they are proposing is what they've termed a percent of formula share approach for distributing performance funds. But it would only kick in those years where the state does not provide any new funding. And as you can see in the second bullet, it would distribute funds using the formula shares determined by the funding model, but it limits the level of redistribution among institutions. Again, because it would only be applied if there were no new funding put in by the state. I think it's important for me to make folks on the call aware that there's a four-step distribution calculation that we currently go through. And this is actually one of those steps. Some of the funding in the current model is distributed using a percent of formula share approach. Other funds are distributed based on the current distribution of funding among institutions compared to what how the model says that funding should be distributed, and looking at those differences. The first step is to say, well, let's get institutions that increase their share of funding, those positive dollars, out of whatever funding is available. The second step is to say, let's take any residual funds that don't cover those positive dollar, or that more than cover those positive dollar amounts. Let's take that residual funding and distribute those funds using this percent of formula share. Next slide, Heather. And I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. This slide is showing a comparison of the actual 2021 performance distribution shown in the first column highlighted in yellow. The next three columns show that one step, which would be a percent of formula share approach. In the first column, well, the second column of numbers under the share of formula approach, those are the fiscal 2021 formula totals. They come right out of the funding model. If you do a percent of total on those formula totals, you can see those percentages in the center column. And then you distribute that same level of available funding, the $11.7 million, using that percent of formula share approach. And that's what's shown in that second yellow column. And you can see, had this been implemented in the current year, and it would have because there was no new state funding provided in the current year, if this approach had been in place and we had applied the formula share approach to the available funds, it would have been that distribution that you see in that second yellow column. And you can see how that differs from what actually occurred in terms of the distribution. UK would have received $2.8 million less in terms of the distribution than they did in the current year. University of Louisville, about $370,000 less. But every other institution, even K-State, Moorhead, and Murray, who received no dollars in the current distribution under the way the model is currently configured, they would have received some positive dollars in terms of a distribution for the current year under this approach. And so, as I say, it limits the redistribution of funds, obviously, when you compare the formula share approach to the full-blown model, if you will, that we actually utilize for 2021. But how much are UK and U of L actually losing? Let's go to the next slide, Heather. What this is showing is, on the left half of the page, is compared to the actual 2% stop loss contributions in the current year, the $11,679,600 total. If you compare that to the actual distribution in the current year, who earned back, more than they contributed, and who had net losses in terms of their stop loss contribution. And again, UK gained 2.9, almost $3 million more than what they contributed in the current year. U of L gained $423,000 more. Every other institution had net losses compared to what they contributed in the current year. On the right half of the page, again, in the first column, we're looking at the actual 2021 2% stop loss contributions, same numbers as in the first column. had we utilized the hypothetical formula share distribution in the current year, because there would have been there was no new state funding, that's that distribution. And now you can see the difference. UK, U of L, they still earn more than what they contributed. They just don't earn quite as much as they would have under the full-blown model. And other institutions, now have positive net gains. K-State, Morehead, and Murray still have a negative difference, but it's a much smaller negative difference than if you were to run the full-blown model. Next slide, Heather. Yeah, so the way that Murray State has proposed this to CPE staff is to say if there was some change in either budget bill language or the statute or the council's administrative regs, if that was allowable, that basically said, as we go forward, if there were some level of stop loss, you have to have some level of stop loss to even have any money to distribute. If there is no new money, and specifically the way they phrased it, if state funding does not equal or exceed the amount of the campus stop loss contribution that is put into the performance fund. So if 15 million is carved out of the base of the institutions and put in the performance fund, if the General Assembly puts in 15 million or more, then you run the model as the full-blown model, if you will, is currently configured. If there's no new state dollars put in and you're just going to redistribute the 2% or whatever stop loss carve out amount is, then you would use this percent of formula share approach, which still utilizes the model formula totals. It still is moving the institutions toward equilibrium, but in a very incremental way. It would take a longer period of time to get to equilibrium if every year you had to keep using this approach. But at the same time, if going forward, the General Assembly doesn't have the funding to fund the performance funding model, it limits that redistribution among institutions.
Bottom line, this is adding another fail-safe, if you will. There's a couple of assumptions that are here that has to be in place, and I'll shut up after this, and I know a lot of people want to jump into this. One is you have to have a certain percent of stop loss moving forward. Number two is that for it to fully operate, Tim Caboni, as your argument posed earlier, it needs to actually have state funding that equals or exceeds the stop loss. I mean, so there's a lot of positives about this, I see, and maybe a few negatives, but the idea that in legislation, what that does is it puts in to play actionable items that happen, levers, I guess, if you want to call it that. And I'm sure, Senator Givens, you have something to say about this, so I'm just going to shut up and let you say it.
Yeah, Aaron, I didn't expect to be called out that way. You haven't done that to me the entire time. This catches me off guard.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I hesitate to hold out too many thoughts, but right off the bat, but I do see a continued effort, and this doesn't diminish the significance of this conversation, but I do see a continued effort to try to, using Bill's phrase, step into incrementally moving toward equilibrium. We've said it 1,000 times. We'll continue to say it 1,000 more. New money would help considerably in the conversation. Let's acknowledge that the 2% stop loss that we do have currently in place does step us incrementally also. So now in my mind, we're saying as we continue this conversation around percent formula share approach, we're saying the truck has a brake on it. Now we want to make sure not only does it have a brake, but it has a backup brake, and we may want to add a third brake. Let's not lose sight of the goal is to continue to serve our taxpayers well that help fund these institutions. I realize the shift in funding, but we got a taxpayer interest for these publicly funded institutions to provide degrees that matter. And this metric, as we've all said, Dr. Brown from KSU, I've written that down. Performance funding metrics are driving significant positive change on our campus. That's a huge statement for the president of KSU to say in light of the impact it's having on his institution. So let's just not lose sight of the good we're doing. And I realize that change is difficult. New money would make it so much better. Let's be cautious we don't lose the good.
I will not disagree with that statement at all. It is driving change all over the system, by the way, not just at KSU. We're seeing some good outputs. And once again, before all this is over, I would like to give my 10 minutes worth of what I think is done for the state, not today, but what I think is done, where the areas that I think we need to increase, because I see myself representing the statewide footprint as a whole. Other questions on this particular topic?
On a broader note, and I think it relates to this too, that I think the equating doing harm with reallocation, I think is not serving us well. I think that what we have to talk about, we make these decisions within our institutions all the time, is that reallocating resources within a system is what strategic systems do. And we have a formula that's guiding those shifts in funding. And I appreciate my colleagues and the desire to prevent any reduction in resource allocation. That makes perfect sense to me. But it also makes sense as an institution that is performing and has an FTE penalty that's built in because of a historical appropriation process, that we have to shift resources. I agree, and Aaron, you pointed out, dollars from the state will help, but I also think there is an efficiency argument around shifting those dollars within the system. And so I think reallocation is a positive thing sometimes, not just a negative, as long as it's not creating great harm.
And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I think reallocation, as we talked about a long time ago, was exactly, I think where the point of, and not to repeat something everybody else has said, there was an assumption that we would be getting new money where reallocation was truly based on, head-to-head competition, true enough, but also against your own improvement, which I think makes sense. Over the years, we haven't gotten that new money, which has exacerbated this conversation. There was some assumption, I think, and I'm once again talking from a president of KSU at the time, some assumption that the new money, I felt like I could compete, to be honest with you, especially on several of these metrics. With the help of new money, I felt like we could compete. Not getting new money truly, I think, created the conversation that we're talking about in many ways, that it is a fiscal cliff now for KSU. It really is. I mean, and for Moorhead too, and I haven't heard Dr. Morgan talk yet, but bottom line, that I think is the conversation. And to me, it's not about whether or not we believe that redistribution of dollars based on performance shouldn't take place. I think we all agreed on that a long time ago. Other questions on this before we move on, Bill, and try to get through some more of this, and then in the end, we'll come back with a summary.
President Thompson, I haven't said a lot today because I've been taking in a lot and trying to process this. And I think if COVID had not hit, the tone of this conversation, this working group would be completely different, because there was going to be new money. I think the House and Senate, maybe we didn't have the exact number, but there was going to be new money for higher education. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and we can't predict the future right now. But I think it's our goal. I don't want to speak for Senator Givens, but I believe I'm correct. Our goal would be that the opportunity presents, there will be new money for higher education, without a doubt. As I'm listening, I respect each and every one of your institutions, your presidents. You all have a very difficult and challenging job, even without COVID. I understand that each of your positions is different. Each of your situations is different. As a member of the General Assembly, I respect that, but my ultimate goal is what's in the best interest of Kentucky. And so that's how we got to drive these decisions on. I know we don't want to just forsake one of our institutions or two of our institutions, but the guiding principle is what's best for the future of our citizens in Kentucky. and we all understand the need to get more people in higher ed, more degrees, more credentials, more certificates. So I'm taking all this in. One question I do have, this is predicated on a 2% stop loss going forward, I assume, Dr. Payne. If we were to have in the future, have a scale where we got up to a 5% or a 10%, under this, as I understand it, let's say we got to a 10% stop loss 10 years down the road, then we had a dramatic event, revenues went down. The state would have to kick in a tremendous amount of money at a 10% stop, be 5 times more money. Am I correct in that statement before this?
Well, not completely. You're partially correct. This looks at what action the General Assembly would take, and then it would apply the model differentially based on whatever funding level the General Assembly adopts. And so if you did have a larger stop loss, let's just say 5%, 10%, whatever that might be, if there was not funding that equaled or exceeded that put in by the General Assembly, the formula share approach would kick in. If there was new funding, you would run the model in its normal way. But it's not requiring the General Assembly to do anything. We would not presume to design a funding model that placed any kind of stipulations on what the General Assembly should or should not do. This model just says General Assembly, fund whatever post-secondary education to the level that you think you can, and then the model will be applied differentially based on whether there's new funding or not.
Thank you.
Yeah, bottom line, Representative Tipton, what you're saying is basically correct. That's right. I mean, we're saying that it is a kicker, as Senator Gibbons said, maybe a backup brake, if you will, if there wasn't new funding at a stop loss level. So in this case, your question is 2%, 5%, does it matter in the difference? Yeah, it does. I mean, in that regard, what we would ask the General Assembly to seriously consider. But this does not tie you to anything, right? It does allow us to run the formula continuously with some different caveats, though. I'm going to move on a little bit, but I think it is important. By the way, Representative Tipton, Senator Gibbons, I do want to say that, and Budget Director Hicks, we worked hard to get new money in higher ed this past year. COVID happens, and I just appreciate the kind of work you guys did. And because I know I was on the phone and texting back and forth constantly, and I appreciate you all having that kind of communication with us as you were really looking at getting us some dollars. So I did want to say that. Any other questions or statements on this before we try to get through a few more of these items? Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, President Thompson. This next decision point has to do with the non-resident student weighting. And I thought it would be helpful, since so many of the work group members are new and weren't part of the original working group 3 years ago. But just to remind everybody, there was a lot of negotiation and compromise about the non-resident student weighting in the credit hour earned metric 3 years ago. There were several institutions that said, hey, the weighting should be equal for non-resident and resident students. Others were saying, no, there should be zero weight given to out-of-state students. Ultimately, what the group was able to get consensus on was a weighting at 50 cents on the dollar, 50%. In the campus summary statements that the council received from the institutions, there were at least 3 universities, Murray, Northern, and Western, that asked that we revisit this non-resident student weighting as part of this current iteration of the working group. Next slide, Heather. And one institution, Murray, actually proposed that we consider eliminating the differential. So the weighting for non-resident students would be 1.0, just like the weighting for resident students is 1.0. Next slide, Heather. I think this slide is very informative in terms of why we, the footnote at the bottom, this kind of summarizes what's going on this slide, that you've got 4 universities, UK, KSU, Murray, and Northern, that would benefit from using higher weightings for credit hours earned by non-resident students. And then you've got the other 4 universities, U of L, EKU, Morehead, and Western, would benefit from using lower weightings. And I'll take Western as an example. If you look at the 50% weighting, Western earned $757,000 in the current year. If the weighting were dropped down to 0.25 for non-resident students, they would earn almost $1.3 million. If it were dropped down to 0 weighting for out-of-state students, they would earn $1.8 million. And so, and what's not shown on this page for K-State, Morehead, and Murray is changes in the hold harmless allocation. So KSU would benefit from the higher weighting because their hold harmless allocation would be decreased. Morehead would benefit from lower weighting because their hold harmless allocation would decrease with a lower weighting. So you've got 4 institutions that would benefit from higher weightings, 4 that would benefit from lower weightings. Next slide, Heather. So I guess the basic question, President Thompson, is do we want to make any changes to the 50% weighting? President Thompson, are you there?
I think Aaron is on mute, Bill, but let me just jump in. And I think this is in line with some of the conversations. There's a lot we're within 2 minutes of a 2-hour meeting. And there's a lot of different things to sort of try and put together. I will say something, especially in light of what Representative Tipton just mentioned, thinking about what's in the best interest of Kentucky largely. And of course, geographic location has some implications. As you know, for Northern Kentucky University, we draw 23% of our students from Ohio, given where we are located. Now, 82% of our graduates stay in this region. So we like to think we add to the economic prosperity of this region writ large. But I think from a state perspective, this would be something to think about. There are differences, and Eli and Neely can add to this in terms of sort of a national model that they have an ability to draw students from across the country and frankly around the world. Our institutions are somewhat limited in terms of a national footprint. We do have much more of a regional footprint, and that would be our contiguous states. But from a state perspective, something that Representative Tipton said, I think makes a lot of sense. Our future long-term prosperity as a state is dependent on our ability to draw diverse talent from around the region and from around the country if we can. And that incentive should not be understated. We are not going to grow as a state from an economic prosperity perspective unless we bring in, because we do have an aging population, and we do need to bring in talent from around certainly the state, but even broader than that. So incentivizing that, our ability to charge higher non-resident tuition has been limited, as I've clearly found out. That may not be the case for UK and U of L. So the tuition policy, which I really appreciate CP and Aaron's leadership in helping guide that, is making a big difference. So of course, with taking all the other things into consideration, I would of course want to advocate that we need to re-examine this weighting.
Let me throw a couple of things in there quickly. One is that we're going to have to reach our 60 by 30 goal, which is our North Star. There's 4 things that we're going to have to do to reach that. And I'm saying this for all of us. One is that we have to get the college going higher. We're at about 51.7% now. We're going to have to get another good, 15 percentage points up. We're going to have to get student success metrics to be more powerful, and y'all are doing a great job. So, we really stepped up to the plate on that one, and that's getting us above that annual percentage rate that we need to get 60 by 30. We're going to have to get more adult learners back in. We've lost about 40,000 over the last many years, and we're going to have to figure out how to get those folks engaged. And number 4, we're going to have to get more out-of-state students here and keep them here. Somewhere around a 40 to 42% mark would be my guess. to kind of get us where we need to go. So our strategies, as you well know, since I've been in this job, is to focus on those 4 big areas to fulfill the workforce needs and the economic needs of Kentucky to get to the 60 by 30. So I would ask us to think about that as one of the big drivers of what we're trying to accomplish, no matter what we do. Now, years ago, when we started this out, there were some arguing for 100% count, some arguing for 0% count. We got at the 50% mark to get us in that place. I just throw that out. And then one other thing, we are at the 11 o'clock hour when we're supposed to stop. I've talked to a couple of presidents who we have another little meeting going on later on, and they want to continue this conversation. So I guess I need to hear from you all whether you want to continue this conversation longer. Heather is sending out a poll to you to figure out when John Hicks, I mean, I think you predicted it right in the beginning. We're probably going to have another meeting. So what would some of you like to do before we carry on this conversation longer?
Aaron, while you wait for everybody, I guess I don't think we can come to a conclusion today. I do have an opinion about this that I would like to share at some point. I'll let you ask when.
Well, I'm going to continue this for at least another 15 or 20 minutes until some people. So you'll have your chance to have that statement, and you can do it now, Neely, actually, if you like. How about that?
I actually went back to Representative Tipton's statement as well about what is in the best interest of Kentucky, and I'm all for bringing more people in, and that's a good thing. But if we are going to be looking at weights, I would much rather spend time about how for underserved populations, URMs, right now it's 3% of our performance funding is actually based on that. I would much rather tweak that than get to the non-resident student weights. And you all know I have advocated for things irrespective of whether it's in the best interest of UFL at a given point or not, because is it the right metrics? I personally feel that as a state institution, I am with changing the tuition policy, as Ashish said. That's something that we can do. I am not in favor of increasing this weight. I think we still have a ways to go with increasing the college education of Kentucky residents.
Neely, let me just throw in and say that I hear you. And to me, it may be 2 different pieces of question. By the way, presidents, we can talk about this ourselves, if you like, in another setting. The point that Neely makes, though, that I'm going to once again tell you up front when I give my little 10-minute spiel, part of what I'm going to say is that the weighting for the underrepresented minorities has worked phenomenally so. I mean, as you know, so we may want to think about things like the low income as another example of increasing. So those to me are different points of tweaking that I think are crucial to the conversation that we've all had, especially Representative Tipton, and I've heard Senator Gibbons over and over say this. Those are the sorts of things I think we'll get to some tweaking points that we have a lot of data to show why we want to do exactly what you're recommending, Neely, no doubt.
President Thompson, before we move on, Heather, would you back up one slide? I want to make 2 quick points about this particular slide and some of the other proposals or suggestions for change that have come in from some of the institutions. Number one, I don't expect any institution to submit a proposal to make a change in the funding model that is not going to result in that institution receiving a larger share of funding through the model. And quite frankly, as I look at who is making proposals for various changes in the model, and I run some scenarios along those lines, that is holding true. And so when Murray State is saying, oh, well, let's increase the weighting for non-resident students in the earned credit hour component, you know, there might be a very firm rationale for that, you know, about, you know, wanting to recruit more out-of-state students, and and a lot of those students stay, and that's good for Kentucky. But at the same time, Murray State University would benefit financially if that increase in weighting were to be adopted by the working group. And of course, the other thing I want to point out is anytime you make any changes in the model, just as in the case of this non-resident student weighting, you're going to have some institutions that benefit from it, and you're going to have some that do not benefit from it. And it's going to be hard to get any kind of consensus around that. And the last point that I will make, let's say we went from a 50% weighting to a 1-to-1 weighting. That is going to throw the model immediately, or if you went in the opposite direction and said 0 weighting for non-resident students, that is going to throw the model out of equilibrium immediately. And so as you get into next year, you're basically at a situation where you've got increased disequilibrium, and now over the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to be trying to move the institutions back toward equilibrium with one another in the same manner that we've done over the past 3 years. And so in some respects, if you make any changes of any major consequence, you're going to undo the progress that we've made over the past 3 years to try to get institutions to equilibrium with one another. And once you hit that equilibrium mark, less funding is going to shift around and the model is going to become even more stable than it already is. So I guess, that's all of the comments I wanted to make.
Yeah, Bill, I tell you what, I want to let us take a quick look. I want to ask you to kind of go through it faster unless people want to ask, because we got just a few minutes. But I want you all to take a look at the rest of it, and we'll come back at another meeting with all the decisions and presidents. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit in between. But Bill, gets to some of the other slides quickly, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, go ahead, Heather. Quickly, let's talk about premiums for underserved populations. I think all of you already know that degrees and credentials in STEM fields or awarded to low-income URM and underprepared students have premiums provided in the model to try to incentivize increased production of those types of degrees. And we've seen some tremendous growth over the past 5 years in STEM plus H, URM, and in the underprepared degrees and credentials at KCTCS. But you'll remember this graph that we're about to look at on the next page. Awards to low-income students have been lagging behind the others. And so 2 institutions have asked us to consider, U of L and NKU, increasing those metric weights for low-income and URM students. So next slide, Heather. So this is the data that you saw a couple of meetings ago. And on the left-hand side of the page, the green bars are the public university model. And it's showing change in bachelor's degrees by degree type. So total bachelor's degree at the top have grown by 11%. STEM plus H have grown by over 30%. URM bachelor's degrees have grown by almost 34%. This is tremendous growth, folks.
Bill, let me just throw in there, this was last year's data. We got some new data to put in to where those numbers have increased, percentage have increased even more.
Yeah.
So just to let you know, Bill's a year behind on these data. We just got the new data whereby it increased significantly more. So I just wanted to throw that in. Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah,
and Aaron, it's really backs up your point. The model is working, but not for low income. I mean, yes, absolutely, right. The model's working.
And the new data shows exactly the same thing. It's not. It's really just, we have to seriously, because you're only getting about a 0.7 that Bill will get to later on where we're at. So we're below what we're trying to do, period, below just the degree itself going out. So this is an area and I'm going to argue now, I'll use my 10 minutes up as I go. This is an area where we have to take some consideration toward tweaks, in my opinion.
Yeah, so
isn't there an overlap between URM and low income though?
Excuse me?
Isn't there an overlap between URM and low income?
There is some overlap, yes. But there's also overlap between low income and overall baccalaureate degrees when you look at some of our institutions who are heavily Pell eligible. So a lot of these have overlaps, absolutely. But the way we do this is in a discrete way. of looking at it, but there are some overlap, no doubt.
Anyway, quickly, the number of low-income bachelor's degrees have grown by less than 1%. On the right-hand side of the page, the purple bars are degrees and credentials produced by type at KCTCS. Total credentials, STEM plus H, URM, again, all showing significant growth. But as you can see, the low-income credentials in the middle of that graph growing at less than any of the other degree types. And we think that there may be a reason for that. If you go to the next slide, Heather.
Well, before you go, Bill, I want to address something Ashish said. He didn't say it, but I'm going to interpret that he said it. You know, some of these are working so well, you may ask the question, do we want to double down on those, right? I mean, like the URN. I mean, if you look at the pool that's there, it may make some sense to even think about increasing that percentage because of the infrastructure, based on what Tim Caboni was saying. They've set up their strategic way of doing things differently because of the model. And I would argue that Eli probably would argue the same point, as well as Neely. I mean, so there's some reason to think that we may want to double down on some of these and increase the percentages. Sorry, Bill.
No problem. Next slide, Heather. So this is a slide that's showing those premiums for the low income and minority student degrees. And just as a reminder, you can see the allocation percentages there in the second column, 9% for bachelor's degrees, 3% for low income, 3% for minority bachelor's degrees. And 3 years ago, everybody was focused on the percentage. But if you look at the current year distribution, we distributed about $517.5 million in the university model in terms of total allocable resources. And you can see the size of each of those pools for a little over 46 million bachelor's degrees, 15 million each for low income and minority bachelor's degrees. But if you divide those pools by the number of weighted degrees produced, you get what I'm calling state funding per degree or a state subsidy per degree number. And so the subsidy per regular bachelor's degree in the current year is about $1 per degree produced. And you're right, President Videa, it's cumulative. So if you have a low income student that earns a bachelor's degree, you get that 1,915, but you also get the additional premium for low income students of 1,336. And if it's a underrepresented minority student, you're getting an additional premium of 5,643 produced. But if you take that state funding per degree for each of those premiums and divide it by the 1,915, you get what I'm terming a funding multiple. And you can see that for a URM bachelor's degree produced, that subsidy per degree is almost 3 times greater than what's being awarded to an institution for just producing a bachelor's degree for a non-minority student.
Bill Senator Gibbons, I'm going to jump in real quick. This is a self-correcting sort of mechanism, though, is it not? Because as that denominator of weighted degrees goes up, the state funding per degree goes down. And so as we start educating more minority bachelor degree attainment students, that dollar value, for lack of a better term, will go down and move closer to what the low income bachelor's level is, correct?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And we knew that at the time, and we wanted to allow room to grow because we wanted to incentivize increased production of those URM degrees. But the question that, I guess would come up to this group is, given the data that we're looking at in terms of low income degree production lagging behind the STEM plus H and the URM degree production and even regular bachelor's degree production, is do we have the funding multiple and the state funding per degree correct for the low income bachelor's degree production?
I just want to throw in one other thing that Senator Gibbons, just to correlate this with your statement. The only demographic that we're showing in the state that we're up in fall enrollment on are URNs. So, I mean, there is also I'm not saying this is a direct causal statement, but there is a correlation. I mean, so I do want to point out that as you increase the numbers of this group, in fact, that it will go down. Yes. Sorry, Bill.
Lastly, I'll just point out the footnote at the bottom. The subsidy for STEM plus H bachelor's degrees produced is almost $3,200 per degree. And that's a funding multiple of 1.7 times a bachelor's degree. So we have higher funding multiples for URM degrees produced and for STEM plus H degrees produced, and a much lower funding multiple for the low-income bachelors, and that's because of the differential in the numbers of weighted degrees produced. Next slide, Heather. President Thompson, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, we're going to run low on time here, but these are all of the items that we're going to have to decide on. I won't talk about them now, but these are decision points that we need to be able to make and have some idea how to make it within the next few weeks. Because this is about tweaking the formula a little bit. This is not about some of the other conversations we've had as much as it is tweaking the formula. The idea that I've heard from many of you offline that believe that we should have some deep conversations around the out-of-state weight and some deep conversations on what it looks like if we increase the URM and as well as the low income. Once again, my 10 minutes worth, I want to throw in adult learning as a possible new metric. Not saying I'm going, that y'all couldn't knock me out with that suggestion, but these are some of the things that goes, Tim, to tweaking the formula. So I think y'all need to give this a deep sort of consideration and think about where you all are playing in this game. But what we know that's happened, behaviors on our campuses, strategic behaviors have happened around all of these items here. So the idea, do we want to increase that strategic effort, decrease it, or keep it the same?
And one last thing quickly, if you look at the second and fourth bullets on this slide, it's not just answering the question, how much do you want to increase a metric like URM or low income, but where are those percentage points going to come from? Because you would have to reduce the weight of some other metric in order to increase the weight for URM or low income in the model.
Bill, do you have that slide? Because I have my suggestions about thinking about where they should come from. But do you have that slide with you, or should we wait till next time?
Yeah, I don't have it in this presentation, President Thompson, but
Well, let me just throw out a suggestion to get us to think about it. I mean, the square footage piece is worth a significant amount. Is that something we want to think about targeting a piece of that to move toward these metrics? So there's ways we can tweak the model without changing significantly the model, but more focus on the student success outputs themselves. So these are the sorts of things that we really need to have. I see Neely's given a thumbs up on my suggestion there. So those are some of the things that I think we have to be very strategic about. Those metrics that haven't worked as well as we want them to work, how can we change the model to push it toward the metrics that drive the statewide agenda or drive the agenda for your campuses? Those are the points that we'll have to decide over the next little bit. I mean, a couple of weeks.
Aaron, I would offer that in the totality here, this is to me a major, this is not tweaking, this is a major rewrite of some legislation, I believe. I would also say that on my campus, the commitment to moving on these metrics would not, and we've done very well on them, probably wouldn't be influenced by whether you went up 2% or down 1%. We're committed to it. I think something else that And my graduate thesis advisor told me one time, if you inflict data long enough, it'll confess to something. And I feel like we have our focus. When we first developed all these, we didn't have necessarily what the financial consequence would be. We had the principles. I feel like today we're just focusing on each proposal in terms of a financial consequence. I don't want us to lose sight of the sort of overall principles we had. And there's one that's embedded in all of this too. And that is the disparity, and it's in parts of this formula. The disparity, and you just mentioned square footage, the disparity that's not recognized explicitly, but implicitly in the cost of educating a physician or a nurse or a dentist or a physical therapist or a PhD student or moving your research numbers to $440 million like we've done and all is not in here. Okay, we agreed that these things were common across our universities. So I just have to speak up and say we tinker with all these little parts. It's a little more than tweaking.
First of all, your statement before responding, I don't have an answer to all this, but before responding is that for me, Eli, this is about principle of moving us forward in the state that's good for the state. That's why you're hearing me heavily on, I may be biased in this area, focusing on those that are most disenfranchised. That's a principle of mine, period, as you all know. And this goes beyond the money. And I agree with you, what you've done on your campus and others in that principle area. Some of the weightings that we have that, that Eli's talking about here, the square footage is a little bit different of a conversation than the weights that we have for the FTE. I mean, that's, Eli's statement to me is making more of that's a fairly large tweak. I would agree with you. The idea that maybe not as much on some campuses as others, we have seen behavioral change, I think, based on the performance funding model as far as what has been done, whether it's for money's sake or for the buying in that we have a need to serve the state as a whole with what we're trying to do. What I do know is that when we look at it, and not just purely to tweak the data or to look at the data so much that it becomes useless, but when we look at some of the big outputs, it's clear that some of these metrics have has helped us to move forward the statewide agenda. Any other questions on this before I move us on and call a meeting end? Hearing none. Bill, is there any last statement you want to make before we pick up the rest of this next time? You're on mute, sir. Bill, you have to unmute. You still haven't. So I'm assuming that he's talking, but I don't hear him.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I would just point out that we're about 30 minutes over, and do you want to take up the remainder of this presentation at the next meeting, or do you want to continue on?
I think what we'll do is we'll pick up the remainder because I think we've covered enough of this for the presidents and myself to have some offline conversations sometimes on some parts of what's left or some parts of this. I would ask everybody to seriously think about these items we put on the table. We can't kick this down we can't kick the can too much longer. So we're going to have to come up with some suggested language to Representative Tipton and Senator Gibbons fairly soon, and to the governor's office So my thoughts are that we're getting down to the nitty gritty. We probably have given you more data, as Eli suggested, that you've ever cared about having. So I think now it comes down to some decision points. And I would ask us before our next meeting to have whatever kind of conversations we need to have with each other, and to have the conversations we need to have on our campuses that we need to derive at some of this. And I'm going to give Senator Givens and Representative Tipton and Budget Director Hicks some last statements here, because we're going to be making these recommendations to you to put in legislation. So I'm anxious, before we end this conversation today, to hear if you got any final thoughts on this before we go to our next set of deliberations and our next meeting.
President Thompson, I just appreciate everybody's input, and I certainly respect all the opinions that have been presented, all the knowledge that's out there. And I wasn't part of the original discussion, but I understand that that was a hard fought decision to get to the final decision. There were a lot of differing views, and I sense we still have a lot of differing views on what direction to go in. But I'm listening. Feel free to reach out to me between the next meeting if anybody has any conversations or questions. But I'm leaning a lot on you all. But ultimately, we have to have a proposal ultimately that can get through the General Assembly. And we still have a lot of unknowns about there, a lot of new members, what the situation is going to be. But I appreciate being part of the conversation, and feel free to reach out. And hopefully we'll get to, I feel like we'll get to some decision points in the near future.
Thanks, sir. Budget Director, I see you're trying to unhook there. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. No, appreciate the conversation, appreciate the data. I've got a set of questions I've already written down, and I'm gonna send to Bill just to understand some of the behind the scenes. Appreciate the commentary of the presidents. That's always very insightful. We've got a model here that has conflicting goals, and in balancing those, against all the institutions, the president's commentaries during these meetings.
Thank you, John. Senator Givens, are you still on? I don't see you anywhere. I think he must have gotten off. Folks, this was a great conversation. And I know that we have a lot to discuss. Presidents, I think we're going to pick this up in a little while on another discussion. But I will say thank you all for this spirited way of doing it. The item and that I will also say is that you all have done things that are powerful and positive, and you've done this in lack of funding. So, I mean, at the very minimum, at least from where I sit, I mean, I'm going to be talking about that a lot over the next many months to a lot of people. I've already been talking about it a lot, but I'll talk about it more. So I definitely don't want to get off from here just with the thought that we're looking at a model unto itself, but that in fact, this model should be representative of the things that, and Eli, I take heart to what you were saying. I'm there with you, my friend, to the core values that we have in higher education and what we stand for. We're much bigger than the model, right? So, and I appreciate that. Okay, folks, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all so much.